Yeah. All right, we're recording. We're off. Welcome, everybody, to 2025, the core concepts and fundamental problems at Theory Underground. So, my goal is to keep this to a nice and punchy sort of hour and then do discussion afterwards. I normally am a huge advocate for the variable length session, and I think that that's especially applicable with the seminars. But for our purposes here, this being an introductory sort of course for people who are new to Theory Underground, as well as people who've been around for a long time, but maybe you got a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and you're kind of looking for, well, what's the real meat and potatoes, and how do all these concepts I keep hearing about relate or tie together, right? And so that's a big part of the goal here. I had a little bit of a crisis going into this. I felt very confident uh, with my lectures that I did for Sociology 101 and 122 this week. And I was planning on pretty much talking about the same thing that I talked about there, except doing it more for a Theory Underground audience. And the problem with doing it that way, I realized, is because to start with what I've been saying I would talk about today, which is the idea of the university and the professional managerial class, we actually also have to talk about the fundamental problems that those courses were responding to, right? And so I'm going to put on the whiteboard here several different things. We start with fundamental problems, and then we've got questions, and then we've got concepts. And of course, these concepts probably come from specific thinkers. And those thinkers probably have texts that are considered canon or primary or essential in some way. So, insofar as we at Theory Underground ever refer to Heidegger, we're not talking about the pastoral poet who's, contemplating the dew on a rosebud in the clearing of the Black Forest, in the late 1960s or whatever. No, we're talking about a specific period of a specific human's life and what he's responding to and the way he's bringing together all of those things in that period of his life, which was extremely atheistic and critical in the most extreme sense, right? This is, in that example, we're talking about somebody who's an ex-Catholic and not yet a dyed-in-the-wool National Socialist. So we're talking about somebody who's between ideologies and is in a period of deep ideology critique, but doing it in a non-Marxian way, right? And he's drawing off of all these different traditions that Marxism tended to not take as seriously, right? And so there's a bunch of stuff that he's privy to that if you don't go through him, well, then maybe you miss it or you only get it in bits and pieces. Well, okay, so then I've raised Heidegger here, obviously, and I've also raised Marx here, okay? Obviously, when we're talking about texts, with Heidegger, it's going to be Being in Time, and with Marx, it's going to be Das Kapital, which looks like Donkey Kong if you just look at the initials, DK. But, it is what it is. These essential texts are ones we're not assuming anyone's going to read in this year, even, right? If we can get these off the ground as a sort of a part of the machinery institutionalized here at Theory Underground, there's a strong chance that in the near future, potentially this year, there will be opportunities for people who have read these books or are looking to read these books to regularly meet with at least me, if not other members of the teaching team. And Nance is nodding his head, right? We started Capital Mondays last year. We went pretty hard with that. But there's another approach that we've been thinking about. But right now, just let's go ahead and bracket out the idea that you would even take on such challenges and say, well, really, what do you need to know about these texts? What do you really need to know about these thinkers? You could study any one of these thinkers for your entire life. And so how deep do you really want to go? Well, when we're talking about the fundamental problems, questions, and concepts at Theory Underground, the thinkers and texts are a basis from which some of us here are coming. Like we come into the life of the mind, or we come into Theory Underground with a basis in these thinkers, these texts, right? But for this course, you don't have to go there. You don't have to go all the way down. You know, it'll be sufficient to understand a few things about Marx, like surplus value and labor power, right? To understand the relations of production and the mode of production. To understand just a little bit about that is going to suffice. Same thing goes for being in time. There are specific things about being in time that are useful information for people who at least want to kind of understand how we're approaching things, right? So we've got the fundamental problems, we got the questions, we got the concepts. A lot of these concepts come from different thinkers or texts, but that doesn't mean that the way that those have been taken up by this emergent school of thought is necessarily a doctrinaire way. We're not necessarily saying this is the correct reading of this person. So for instance, the way that I will refer to ressentiment, it's always the way that I use ressentiment. I use a more expansive and less extreme, though potentially more radical understanding of, or modification of ressentiment, right? So is ressentiment going to make it onto this list of fundamental concepts? This is a big problem. The crisis that I was trying to articulate is to say that the PMC and the idea of the university courses come out of a context. They're relational, meaning we can't understand why we start with these without talking a little bit about some of the fundamental problems that we find ourselves in. And so I guess what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about all of it, okay? But I want to start with the point of departure, which is the three crises, which will be the title of this talk. So the three crises that I think all, or at least most of us, relate to in a pretty strong way are a crisis of the academy, a crisis of the attention economy, and the crisis of activism. Not necessarily in that order. So I put 1, 2, 3, but let's think about that maybe more like bullet points, eh? Because it really could be in a different order depending on the person. And what I'll just say about that is, for me, the academy was something that I wanted to go do because I didn't see anything else on my horizon of possibilities that made sense at the time. I was kind of going into it thinking, I want to learn more, I want to develop myself, but I also kind of had this fantasy of like, I want to make an impact on the world. I do want to change things positively. And so there was this part of me that was like, oh, it's a practical degree that I'm going for. I'm going to go for forest management. But then there was this other part of me that was like, yeah, but before I get too caught up in forest management, I could take some electives, and I'll take political philosophy as one of those electives, and I'll take psychology as another one of those electives. And of course, by the end of that semester, I was reading for the first time in my life in a real sense, right? Like something beyond skimming and Sparks notesing. I was like really engaging with Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics and Hobbes's Leviathan and actually being forced by the weekly quizzes that were written to engage pretty seriously, because in the first week my quiz was failed. And I thought, well, I did a great job. And so I went to the office hours with this professor and I was like, how did I get an F? And that was when he told me, oh, well, with philosophy, you can't just like sit at the beach and read it. Like you actually have to take notes and, you know, engage with like the passages that you're referring to, and you have to unpack them in a way that proves that you actually did the reading. And so that's what I mean by I was forced to actually read for real for the first time. Well, the academy is a place for understanding. We'll go more into the idea of the university, but for right now, I'm going to just say it's a place for understanding, for developing one's understanding, for developing one's capacities. The crisis of the academy is that that is becoming increasingly difficult at the university due to various reasons. And I think the sort of catch-all term that people will use these days is the neoliberalization of the university. And that's fair. And that neoliberalization is undoubtedly a big factor, and we can get into that a little bit. But I also just kind of want to signpost that with an idea. Would large amounts of funding going towards the university change its course? Or would it alter those worst tendencies? Maybe. But also, maybe not. And it does seem like framing the problem with the university today as a crisis of neoliberalism makes it so that the assumption is, well, if it was free or if it was funded nicely, then, well, that would take care of the problem. But the crisis of the neoliberalization of the university is also a crisis in terms of it losing its sense of priorities, of it not having its telos in sight, right? So there's the idea of the university as an ideal, something to strive towards and something to measure oneself against, right? So if administrators are doing their jobs, if the faculty are doing their jobs, if the students are doing their jobs, that means that this institution should be measuring itself against this ideal, which would be its goal, its telos, right? But if the competing interests of business and politics have caused it to go off course, then just putting more money into it is not necessarily going to solve the problem, right? Then we have the crisis of the attention economy. People who are looking for understanding and a sort of rich milieu of other thinkers to develop oneself with, who don't see a future at the university, they might just go to the internet. But there are problems with the internet, chief among those being audience capture, algorithmic siloing, and the incentives for sensational, trending, timely shit, which Theory Underground has for 2 years avoided for the most part. And then in the last few months, we've started doing that a little bit more, right? With Why Left, with What's Right, with, what are you saying, Nance? No?
Um, I want to give Theory Underground more credit. I think, like the commodity form that forces content on the internet, like you have to adopt this form of the commodity form itself to be on the internet, to be part of the attention economy. But that doesn't dictate content. And the thing is, like, the overwhelming majority of people in the attention economy are kind of dealing with the form. So while I think we are mimicking or aping the form of content, the actual content of our content is still, I mean, it's still a healthy meal. Like, we're not out here giving people Skittles and Jolly Ranchers. We're out here giving people steak and potato dinner. So I think that's a point worth pointing out, because while we are doing the podcasting and we're trying to get the clips and the attention grabbing, doing the thing, we're also doing 3 to 4 hour podcast episodes that cover shit that
Right.
Not only
No.
cover things that don't get covered, but the way we engage with
Yeah.
is different. It's different.
No, 100%. And that's why we did the critical media theory class followed by seminar over the last 2 years, was to really hone in on what is the medium, and for in this sort of McLuhanite register, what that means when you say medium. It really means our techno-digital extended central nervous system that is outside of and between us, and sort of in a sense before us, right? Everything you can say about society being an emergent property that has determinate effects, framing our horizon of possibilities as humans, as individuals, as groups. Everything you can say about the society, you can also say about the medium. But the medium and the society are not necessarily the same thing, right? Capital and the medium are not necessarily the same thing. Though, of course, the way that the medium exists has a lot to do with the fact that the internet and all of the technologies that go into it, in the ways that they've been developed, have been developed by and for, or at least for, on the one side capital, on the other side state. There's like a Venn diagram of the interests of the state overlapping with the interests of capital. Often those interests are competing, but also when it comes to us being made more legible and us self-reporting everything, well, that is in the interest of pretty much everybody who is involved in politics or in business, right? To make the population more legible means more predictable, right? But of course, human beings are extremely unpredictable at the level of their singularity. Insofar as you are a singularity, you defy the rules. You are an singular humans are exceptions to the rules that sociologists talk about when they are talking about the averages operational in a society. Okay, so the attention economy is a crisis in the sense that people feel distracted, people feel overwhelmed by too much information, people feel angst, depression, boredom, addiction, ADHD, all of these things piling up, and they all have something direct to do with the medium itself. The medium being inseparable here from the interests of capital and state. But it's our ecology, it's our environment, it's an extension of our central nervous system. It calls into question perception and interpretation, right? So that becomes a serious issue. And then finally, activism. Yeah, so audience capture in the attention economy versus busy work and fake signaling in the academy, right? Or being captured by an administrative schedule that has you constantly lowering your standards and stretching yourself thinner so that you can basically try to sell people who are not there to read or take seriously the things that you're teaching in general, right? There's going to be exceptions in every classroom, but if the overwhelming majority of your students are kind of just coming through with like this kind of disinterested or non-committal attitude, and they're not really expecting to read, well then, I would say that that's a worse problem than getting captured by the attention economy in a sort of sense. You're getting captured by the undergraduate mentality. You're getting captured by serving down in such a way that doesn't assume what I try to assume about every one of you that I'm looking at right now. I try to assume that every one of you is torn between your base level worm being and your higher human capacities, right? So worm being is really like, when Thomas Hobbes is going to talk about we are driven by the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, right? Attraction and aversion. Yeah, so are worms, right? This is a basic thing that we have in common with all other creatures, and that's fine. We definitely, I encourage you all to avoid pain and pursue pleasure, within reason. But of course, there are reasons to forego pleasure and take on pain in the short term for longer term benefits. Some of those cashing in on your talents, cultivating those talents, self-actualizing your higher human capacities, right? This is getting at one of those essential ideas here, which is virtually purposive. Meaning we are the virtually purposive being, which is to say, we are never as we appear or as we are. One of the most important things about every one of us is what's on our horizon of possibility, and more importantly, what we would never even consider on that horizon. And in fact, the things that we would never even consider on that horizon might be more determinative of our behavior in the world than anything else. If being the kind of person who is worthy of respect in society just doesn't even seem plausible on your horizon, and instead on your horizon all you're focused on is the thrills of the week, that's obviously going to have a big impact on your behavior. But if you get a bunch of positivist scientists in the room with that person, and they sit there and just describe you on the basis of behavior alone, they're not going to be getting at what's not in the room, right? Dealing with negativity and lack is part of what continental philosophy does. From Hegel onwards, every philosopher is thinking about this or reacting against it in the case of Deleuze, right? But even then, what's not there might be more important than what is there. And the example that everybody always uses here is Sartre with his friend Pierre. Pierre's not at the coffee shop. Well, if you bring the positivist scientist into the coffee shop and have that person go off of everything that's present, then you're missing the fact that Pierre is not there, and that Pierre not being there might be why Sartre is crying in the corner. Oh no. You can't figure out the reasons based off of just what's in front of you, right? There's more to the story. So the academy, the attention economy, and activism all relate to the virtually purposive, since I brought that into this right here, which is just to say, if you have a person who doesn't do anything with their life and then they die, that's a tremendous loss. That person had potential. That person needed a purpose. People need a purpose, and they need to develop their potential. And if the entire system is developing people in a way that only actualizes them in a very specific way, that forecloses other ways, then that can be concerning. And the most extreme example that I'll use frequently is the little girl picking coffee beans in Guatemala. I have her on my sociology and critical social theory poster that I use for class. Some of you may have seen it in a thumbnail before, but there's just like this little girl picking coffee beans. I just drank a bunch of coffee before coming here. And guess what? I was not thinking about the little girl who might have picked it, right? I was just drinking it. Well, this is the way that the world works. It reifies people as they appear, which is ripping them out of their context. Their context is based in the relations of production. That little girl whose life is framed by this coffee bean picking activity. She is in a place in the mode of production, and that frames her horizon of possibilities. And if she was delusional enough to believe that she had the same horizon of possibilities as a girl her age in middle-class America, we could say that there's a mismatch between her actual position in the mode of production and the relations of production versus her horizon of possibilities, right? How many of you have unrealistic ideas on your horizon of possibilities? Now, unrealistic ideas can be great, right? We can shoot for the sky in a sort of way. We can have ideals that are not obtainable, but they're big motivators. So like in terms of ideal ego ideal, there's ways that that can be good, but there's also ways that that can become an unrealistic expectation that you're a perfectionist about that then beats you down and makes you feel bad about yourself. And a little bit of theory that helps you understand your place in the relations of production and then hone in on your actual horizon of possibilities and not this Hollywood image of what an average person's horizon of possibilities is, that can be liberating itself. And that doesn't mean like, oh, you need to come to terms with your shitty predicament, right? Or at least you don't need to accept it and stop there. Maybe you do have to come to terms with it, reconcile yourself to the situation, be a realist, and then by doing that, now you're actually able to do something about it. But you're not going to be able to do something about it if you're just convinced that your life is going to be as easy as Elon Musk's or whatever, right? So different people, different horizons of possibility. Horizon of possibility always framed by the relations of production. And so I'll just go ahead and put the shorthand for all of these things right here. Horizon of possibilities, relations of production, like that. And then mode of production. And of course, the mode of production is capitalism, maybe entering its neo-feudal phase, we don't know. But generally speaking, it's capital, right? The boots on the ground of 150 different countries that the United States has active across the planet is to keep markets open, force people to be democratic, which means don't close your markets to us. That's really what that means, right? This frames everything. And so the horizon of possibilities, the relations of production, the mode of production directly relate to our virtually purpose of life. And then, of course, this is going to be a nice little segue into the structural stultification of time energy. But let's bring it back over here to the academy, the attention economy, and activism. This is a legitimate way of doing things, by the way. I realize people coming in on this for the first time might realize I'm jumping back and forth. I own that, and also I think it's important with relational concepts. Part of the work of responding to prompts that you will get later this week and will be available to people in the future. Part of the work is to just, in your own words, talk a little bit about how the horizon of possibility, the relations of production, the mode of production relates to the human as a virtually purposive creature, and therefore what is the problem with the structural stultification of time energy. But then we also have to relate all of that to the three crises. So the crisis of the academy, the crisis of the attention economy, and the crisis of activism. And that one in particular is one that I think people who haven't really been listening to what I've been doing with Benjamin on Why Left might be a little bit more out of the loop on, especially because I never published Moratorium, because I didn't want to finish writing it, because by the time I was halfway through that book, I was already a different person. The process of writing it out had already helped me enough. And then I also just didn't feel the need to justify myself to other people. And I was kind of just like, whatever, you'll all figure it out. I don't need to finish writing this book. But the short version of that is just to say, I gave a significant period of my life to activism. And I burnt out. I burnt out in a way I think a lot of people might have. But of course, not all of you are around in 2020, much less 2016. And I'll just say it this way. I was really into Marx. And I also thought, hey, Marx is useless unless there's a working class movement. You can't make a working class movement by raising your consciousness reading Marx. Like there actually has to be a working class movement for Marxist ideas to matter for any reason, right? And that's one of the things I like about Chris Catrone. He understands that, right? You don't use Marxism to create a working class movement. No, you just have to build the working class movement, and then Marx might be useful here and there towards that end, right? But I was already Marx-pilled by the time I saw Bernie running, and I got excited by hearing him talk because he was speaking, it seemed like, directly to me and kind of my people, really like everybody I knew before college, the overwhelming majority of whom are non-political or completely disenchanted and not believing in the system, not believing in the two-party system, in either party, neither left nor right. You'll have people who are generally more liberal, but they don't vote. Or they vote, but it's because of a single issue and not because they have any serious hopes. Maybe it's just because they've bought into some lesser evilist narrative or ultimatum. you know? And sometimes it's just to keep membership in a certain group. You know, having the little I voted sticker on your hat or your water bottle can get you far in certain circles. You know, especially, you know, I'm on campus right now teaching, and there are still people with their little I voted stickers. You know what I mean? It's like, a civically responsible person. Fantastic. Good for them. But is that really the only way that we can affect social change? Is it by voting? Is it by becoming a spokesperson for an identity group? What about an ally or a spokesperson? You can become a good ally. You can become a good spokesperson. You can become an influencer on YouTube. Or you can encourage other people to vote by canvassing. And then finally, protests, demonstrations. And then, of course, we can always say riots, looting. And then we could talk about like farmers markets, but only for people between the ages of 17 and 35 who look like they're punks, you know, and that's called mutual aid, and that's going to solve capitalism, right? Nance and Benjamin are laughing at that, but for anybody who's offended,
I've been there, man. I spent close to a decade doing that community garden shit, and I think probably for a while we were convinced it was the escape route to capitalism, dude. It's not, dude.
there's an issue with activism, and it gets talked about in various ways. And one of the big ways of talking about it is that it's a crisis of representation, or that representational politics have taken over redistribution oriented politics. You know, so this is also where you'll get this line that the issue is wokeness or identity politics. But for anybody who was really excited about the prospect that over 70% of Americans were on board for Medicare for all, but the movement for Bernie got captured by people who wanted to add every extremely niche identity category to the center of the movement, thus, in the space of 4 years, losing a ton of the states that had previously supported Bernie that would not normally go blue or not normally turn up for a Democratic candidate, right? That issue of, every little niche blue-coded issue has to be put in the center. And the more niche, the more at the center it has to be. That became a problem, right? Now, the ways that people respond to that problem were with words like, well, we need a class politics. We need a materialist politics. We need structural change. And by the way, the rad libs were really quick to adopt the language of all these things, especially the word structural, which started to get kind of passed around even on Netflix shows. Oh, it's systemic racism. Oh, it's structural racism. But of course, somehow it's not about you, and it's not about your feelings, and it's not about your opinions. But then if you're not voting the way they want to, then you're not anti-racist in this structural way. But now it's right back to about you being an individual with the wrong opinions. It was like this weird sort of whiplash. And the sort of peak of the absurdity was between 2019 and 2020. I always just like to point out a couple of examples. I always use the no clapping at the DSA as one, and the cancellation of Dr. Adolph Reed Jr. as another, right? An organization that wants to fundamentally change America and harness the desire for large-scale structural change that people actually have, is going to lose the plot if it does so in a way that's repulsive to the overwhelming majority of Americans. Not just repulsive, but necessarily leads to distrust, right? Distrust of the people who are saying that they have the solutions, right? So there's these three crises: the academy, the attention economy, and activism. Burnout with all three is what led to Theory Underground. And trying to harness ideals from each of these three things, while at the same time countering certain tendencies of all three, is part of what makes what we're doing here unique. And that's why we wanted to start out everything 2 years ago with the Idea of a University course, followed by the PMC course, and then the Critical Media Theory course. Each of those courses is responding to one of these three crises, right? So you can see that the attention economy one obviously leads to critical media theory. The academy one obviously leads to the idea of the university. And the activism one, well, we didn't have a course on that, not necessarily, but that is what the PMC course is ultimately about. Because as Thomas Frank says in Listen Liberal, what happened, or what does it mean, or what do you think happens when the left-wing party in a two-party system resents the populace, or is openly disdaining, looking down on, and coding itself against the majority of working class people in that country, right? When the left-wing party is doing that, how do you really expect any serious change? At that point, it becomes plausible that somebody who's more right-coded could potentially lead a Medicare for All movement within the Republican Party. Because the Republican Party has, for at least 30 years, developed a line of sort of like a sort of populist critique against the East Coast elite liberal. And you could use that line and that sort of sentiment to potentially realign something like the Republican Party, right? Now, of course, I never really felt any serious hope in that idea, but I could understand why a person would think that. At the point that you've been involved with something for 7 years, at the point that you've been involved with Democrats and the Democratic Socialists of America and various Marxist organizations, and you realize, like, the people who are being attracted to anything left-coded are dispositionally opposed to the majority of Americans at like a gut level, where conceptual change probably won't make much of a difference. It leads you to think something's either wrong, or our assumptions or expectations about the left versus the right, that might be wrong. And so then this leads to all kinds of questions about reform versus revolution. Not in the sense of like, should society be reformed or revolutionized, which is also an important question, but should the left be reformed, right? Should the left be reformed? It's very much like, should Christianity be reformed? I know lots of Christians who are very big-brained. You know, Theory Underground has gotten me into close proximity and working relationships with quite a few people who I look up to who are Christians. But their kind of Christianity would not be recognizable to 99% of Christians in the United States. And the 99% of Christians in the United States who would say, get out of here, my reading the Bible is better than yours. What are you going to do? What are you going to say? How are you going to influence them? Like, how are you going to radically reform the institution of the church via recourse to schooling people on what the proper idea of the church is? If you want to see serious change within a short period of time, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, do you really think you can reform Christianity in the next 50 years, guys? Does anyone really think that you could? I mean, maybe in a church, or maybe in a small town, Or maybe you could start like some sect, some radical sect online, which is kind of how I see stuff like leftist. Oh, that's not what leftism is, guys. The left is really this thing. And then they uphold the idea based on some kind of a history lesson so as to raise the person who's committed to the left to then go, oh, I need to change how I do this thing. And it's like, yeah, but you're arguing with people at this explicit level when implicitly the reason a lot of people are getting involved, there's a lot of other factors going into why they got involved in the first place. People are not just coming to activism because they're desperate, because these are desperate times that call for desperate measures. And so people are going to sacrifice their lives to try to make the world a better place. I think there is a part of that. But how much of that is a post hoc rationalization of trying to legitimate yourself in the relations of production as you move towards your 10-year plan for a career? Right? The careerist goals of the professional managerial class. And the fact that the left in the United States is overwhelmingly professional managerial class, or made up of people who want to be or think they share a horizon of possibilities with people who are, or who were trying to become so. Maybe they went through college and now they're falling. They're failing. These are the fallen professionals Benjamin talks about in The Way is Shut. But the PMC and the idea of the university in particular are related here. So if you were to say, write about this in a few days, you can't just say that the PMC course is a way of dealing with the issue of activism, whereas the idea of the university is a way of dealing with the academy, because these are both intimately tied together. And trying to show why is something that I've been thinking about a lot. And I think I can kind of pull it together like this. I wanted to start with what's closest. Rather than start Theory Underground with having some famous guest lecturer, or rather than teaching whatever the most popular book might be, to instead make a very bold statement, right? I consider it a costly signal to do courses on something that you're not going to get a lot of signups for. We made a very costly signal by saying, no, we're going to start with the idea of university. Most people will not immediately understand why we would do that, right? But if you have an ideal ego, or ego ideal, based in some kind of a fantasy construct of what it means to be an important person who makes a serious contribution in the world, and if that idea came down to you through the sort of culturally popular ideas that people have access to, maybe like a movie like Good Will Hunting, right? If you have like this idea of like, oh, I could intervene through ideas and consciousness raising, right? Or I could intervene by making an intervention in a field as some kind of a either outsider or insider, whether you're in the university or not. If your idea of how to make a big impact in the world is in part being a smart person or being accomplished within the university system, well, then you share something with most people who either belong to or want to belong to the professional managerial class. It has its own mode and mindset, and its mindset and mode have fundamental operating assumptions. And so that this point about how it has a mode and a mindset is very important, because otherwise people turn this concept, this class category, into an argument about the category itself and whether a person belongs to that category. This is where workerist identity politics takes over the term PMC. Workerist identity politics is basically like, oh, I'm a worker. Who are you, some PMC guy? Right? It's that kind of approach where you use PMC as a slur. which became popular, I think, thanks to the Red Scare podcast, and I don't know who else. Just very dim-witted socialites in the podcast sphere, right? They just would use this term PMC to kind of get at the fact that there is obviously sort of a popular resentment against the virtue hoarding professional middle class, right? But then when you do that, when you fall into this way of thinking where it's like, oh, what you say is either legitimate or not on the basis of your identity, whether you belong to the working class or whether you belong to the PMC, everything important about the term gets lost, right? And so this is why the course was not just called the PMC, it was called PMC Consciousness and Ideology. And the point is, we're always going to have a mixture of people at Theory Underground. On the one side, those people will be people who have gone through the university and were successful within that context, or we'll have people who never went, or something in between. There's always the in between. Someone who dropped out, they realized this treadmill, this grind, this isn't what I'm here for, it's not going to do it, or oh, there's no future in this, I've got to drop out, or something else happened. You had children, whatever, new responsibilities arose and you weren't able to finish what you were there for. There's a lot of reasons why people don't finish college, but we've got some kind of a mixture between people who never went and people who they did fine there, right? I graduated with honors. I have a 3.9 all the way through my master's. Like I was just good all the way through. I was a tryhard and I was trying to prove something and I had something I really wanted to prove. And in part, I rationalized that by saying it was because I was the first in my family to go to college. I had to kind of set this good example. And part of that meant just, if I'm going to take out loans, then I have to really, really use my free time to get it done, and actually prove to myself that I'm not just wasting my time here, right? But people coming in to an organization that does some of the things that the university does today, and that satisfies or scratches certain itches that the PMC might have, is going to, over time, develop an audience and a student base of people with PMC mindsets, modes, operating assumptions. And that's not always a bad thing. In fact, to a certain extent, that might be a good thing. It's something that we might be able to strategically harness, but it's also something that we want to be self-aware of. And more importantly, as workers who are in the underground, who are thinking about doing this thing called theory in an attempt to try to understand the situation, we do want to sort of challenge not just the mindset and mode of the PMC, but also like that fantasy. Like, what does it mean to be a worker at Amazon who has a fantasy of being a professor when you've actually got no goal of being a professor, but you spend all your time listening to videos by professors talking about ideas? Is there a way to harness that towards something better while at the same time countering the part of it that's just some kind of a fantasy that's going to make you feel bad and lead to nothing, right? Well, one way that could be potentially harnessed is to say there is something special that the professions are privy to, that the professions come out of something serious, that the proper occupations that these professions represent or have captured, those occupations are genuine callings. That it's not pure ideology, but there are genuine callings that people can feel pulled towards, and that they are real services to humanity. Whether we are in capitalism or any other society, having real doctors matters. Whether we're in capitalism or any other society, having people who genuinely care about philosophy and spend their whole lives trying to understand it and share that with other people and help them enter into their wheelhouse, that matters, right? Thus, the idea itself. To start critique at Theory Underground, we wanted to focus on the ideal as opposed to the shitty situation, right? This shitty situation is what we see before ourselves. This shitty situation is where professors are using AI to grade student papers that were written by AI. And then I have a student this week who skipped the first week of classes. This just happened. He skips the first week of classes. I say, hey man, you're going to get dropped from the course on Friday if you don't get me an essay that compares and contrasts the first two lectures to sort of prove that you're here for it, because otherwise it'll be too late. You got to make up ASAP or you're going to get dropped from the course. I sent that email to 10 people. One person did the thing. The other people all got dropped. But the one person who did the thing, I am 98% sure he wrote at least most of it using AI. And so then I'm using AI to try to assess if he used AI, and him using AI is actually normalized at the university, and the professors are using AI to grade these papers, right? Like it became like this really weird thing that I was like in the middle of it all, and I was like, wow, I really won't miss this. Like this is really ridiculous. I'm giving more attention to a paper that probably was written in 30 seconds than I am to the paper that was probably written over the course of a day. And the reason I have to spend all this extra time thinking about it is because of the way it was written. It comes off suspect, right? It does not come off like a freshman piece, comes off more like something that someone who's been in the academy for 20 years would have written, right? And I'm sitting there going, no. He also referred to the lecturers at one point. Well, I'm the only lecturer. So, the AI doesn't know that. He would have known that. But I think this one might have, slipped through his filter. This is a metonym for a bigger problem, right? I'm using an anecdote, but the point is that we are in a post-trust era. And of course, there's a million ways that cashes out, the idea of being in a post-trust era. But we're officially at a post being able to trust that people are actually there for the right reasons, or that they even read the assignments, or that they even wrote the assignments that they turn in, which might come off better written than the people who actually wrote assignments, right? And it's a hell of a thing to be on the guard for, because at the same time, it's like, dude, I don't really care. Like, he needs a job coupon. If I kick him out of the class for doing this, what does that prove? I don't really know. I don't really know what my responsibilities are in this situation, right? Because it's like he's going through the motions. I should probably just go through the motions and focus on the people who are there for the right reasons. It's just hard to even tell who's there for the right reasons. And so one of the best ways to know is to go ahead and teach what you're interested in teaching to an audience of people who can't be there for the credit reason, at least, right? Because none of you are going to get credit for it. So boom, solved. Now we've officially at least countered one of the worst tendencies, because now I get to speak to people who are just here for something presumably in itself, right? It's a good in itself, and that's why we care. But it's not just in itself, is it? All of this for what? The crisis of the academy, the crisis of the attention economy, the crisis of activism. All three of these are not actually crises unless you have a goal that we haven't put on the board yet. And that goal is something I have referred to as large-scale structural change. LSSC. Large-scale structural change, whether from above or from below, whether hierarchical or horizontal, whether reformist or revolutionary. Those are all just questions of means. But as an end, large-scale structural change is the only way capital can be responded to without it just doing its rhizomatic thing and relocating. Right? You can have any state or nation state try to deal with the worst tendencies of capital within its interior, but if it's going to be successful in doing so, it's probably going to be punished by the global economy. It'll be put into Cuba territory, right? Well, that's a big problem because it means that large-scale structural change requires a new world order in a sort of sense. And a new world order is obviously something that conspiracy theorists everywhere are terrified of, right? And of course, after the 20th century, when we think of large-scale structural change, we think of totalitarian disasters. Disasters in management, but also just disasters from world wars. And those world wars, in part, stem from the United States and Soviet Russia both realizing, and also, let's be honest, Nazi Germany, all three realizing, oh, if we're to get this way of life that we want, it will require conquering the entire rest of the world, right? So you have like three giant powers all being like, we have to do this, okay? Now I'm being fast, and I'm speaking loosely, and I'm not a historian, and all I'm trying to say is large-scale structural change has connotations that are negative, right? When you're talking about people doing top-down global redistribution or taking over the means of production or, controlling the economy, that's a complicated thing. It gets very complicated because we're talking about people's time and energy. We're talking about a global system that is job-centric today. Now you could say, well, it's not really job-centric, it's capital-centric, and all those jobs are serving capital, which is why nobody has any time or energy, and so that could be countered by traditional socialist means, and that's possible. It's something on the table. I consider it a worthy thing to think about. But it's a problem. Do you see? This is a fundamental problem. Large-scale structural change is, if not the fundamental problem, it's one of them. And I'm trying to decide. I can't really figure it out. I don't want to be artificially schematic, right? It would be artificially schematic for me to be over here and be like, all right, everybody, you see there's this fundamental problem and it leads to this this core concept. Then there's this fundamental concept and it leads to this core concept. When a lot of these are relational and rely on each other, and I think trying to figure out, like, is this actually the fundamental problem is worth it? Because the other issue here is the structural stultification of time energy, which I put down here, right? So if you want to change the university, which has become neoliberalized, which means people work more for less, it's basically what that means. It also means that there's less government funding, right? Taxes do not go to support the arts or research unless that research is helping advertisers or the war machine, right? But if you want to help the academy, or if you want to help change how we engage with the medium, or if you want to be a part of large-scale structural change, you're going to realize that these issues with the academy, the attention economy, and activism are not just issues internal to these institutions or fields. You're going to realize that there is a bigger or more fundamental crisis. If you try to organize with other people, or if you try to discover and cultivate your talents or other people's talents through tutelage, you're going to discover that we are structurally stultified of our time energy. That structural stultification might be the sort of linchpin of the entire thing. For Mikey, and for those who are new, of course, Mikey of the Dangerous Maybe, Michael Downs, also he has a seminar here, of course. A man who needs no introduction, but because this is the first in a series, I figure I might as well. Mikey and I have obviously been developing our philosophical relationship and selves for the last 12 years or something like that. And time was always on the front for us. It was always about how nobody has time and we don't have time. We want to be Renaissance men. We want to be theorists. We want to be able to actually make serious contributions, and being able to make serious contributions in the life of the mind means a serious amount of time spent engaged in the problems, concepts, texts of these fields. Oh, but I have to work. And outside of work, I'm exhausted, right? And so that would be enough probably to eventually come up with time energy as a working concept. But it didn't come from that. It comes out of trying to organize, especially in the Bernie period, and realizing people really only can show up unreliably. People feel energized, they show up, they say they're going to be a volunteer, and they're so excited, and then the following week it's hard to actually do the training with them. Chances are they've already fallen out. Or you do a training or a series of trainings, and then they don't ever follow through. And of course you could say, oh, well, that's just people, especially leftists, they're all like college kids, they're flaky. Yeah, no, not with the Bernie movement. There was quite a diverse range of ages of people actually doing the ground game for the Bernie activism, right? It eventually got captured by millennials who were trying to develop their influencer careers. But before it got captured by them, it was a very mixed sort of grassroots contingency. Structural stultification of time energy comes from realizing that even when people really, really, really want something, at the end of the day, what wins out is their job. What wins out is the thing that funds the solution to the problems posed by necessity. That's not, oh, people are fickle, people don't really know what they want, people are just overcommitting. No, it's real. Large energy infused, repeatable blocks of time reliably available don't exist between us. It doesn't exist between us. And then you could think of a time in your life when you had what I call relative time energy, which is to say, yeah, when I was a certain age, I didn't have to go to school one summer and I just got to do whatever I wanted all summer long with very little supervision, basically no chores. I had an allowance. I could go down to the gas station and get my soda and my snack every day, and then I could spend all day at the skate park and I could practice the guitar when I was bored. And yeah, cool, good job, hooray for you. That's not time energy though, in this more serious sense, as in it's not reliably available between people. Now, if you're thinking of like children, you're thinking about something out of context, right? If you're thinking about 7-year-olds or 14-year-olds, you're thinking about a generational slice of humanity. And if that generational slice of humanity does not have time energy with its elders, then it's not able to fill out a robust reference constellation, right? A constellation of reference points that puts some meat on the bones of your big other and gives you a more variegated or ego ideal or ideal ego, right? If you're pretty much like a latchkey kid, it's like Hollywood gives you ideas of what parents are supposed to be. You don't have parents, and you just wish that it was a certain way, but also you just don't have real adult guidance, right? Teachers who are overworked and underpaid in giant industrial schools don't count either, right? You might get a little attention from one of them and that changes your life and alters the course of your entire journey. Sure. But it's not the same as having like robust intergenerational relationships with people who are able to offer you the kind of tutelage that's dialed into your singularity and its talent, right? So, of course, the virtually purposive animal ties in directly to the structural stultification of time energy, because without time energy, you're not able to discover or at least cultivate those talents that require amounts or massive amounts of sacrifice. So whether you're trying to be a researcher or scholar, either in the academy or in any field that's opened up within, or at least maintained within the academy, whether you're trying to be someone serious in an academic field or do something serious like that in the attention economy, or if you're just trying to change the world, you're going to run into the structural stultification of time energy. There's a bunch of other big problems that we'll get into in future lectures in this series, but for now I really just wanted to hone in on large-scale structural change. Trying to do large-scale structural change leads you to the realization we don't have the time energy for that, either at the ground level or at the top-down level. Everybody is kind of rushing out ahead of themselves without the ability to step back and enter that kind of space of skole from which they might be able to get some critical distance from their assessment of the situation, or sorry, their assumption about the situation. Can you guys still hear me? My phone just, or my headphones said that it lost connection. Yeah, you can hear me? Okay. That's great. All right. So time energy might be the most important concept. It's obviously the thing that we talk about the most. It's this thing that we consider the means to the good life. But the question of the good, much less the good life, that question is one of the fundamental questions. The fact that we don't have anything that's plausibly or remotely close to the good life leads us to the realization that large-scale structural change is necessary. Trying to do large-scale structural change leads you to the realization we don't have time energy. That leads us to the realization that time energy is this thing that we all lack and that we all need. And in that case, I'll draw it like this. I'll put a square around the time energy symbol and then a diamond. The diamond is for possibilities. The square is for necessity or necessary in modal logic. And so you can say the condition of possibility using this square and diamond. The condition of possibility for large-scale structural change would be time energy, right? Okay, but now there's a chicken or egg problem, isn't there? Because you would need large-scale structural change to get everybody their time energy. But you need time energy to get large-scale structural change. Fuck! What are we supposed to do about this? Right? Well, there are various approaches. Before large-scale structural change is made, there might be ways of doing things differently here at the ground level between ourselves. Theory Underground is a critical media theory experiment meant to harness and counter various tendencies of the academy, attention economy, and in the world of social change and activism. Harnessing certain tendencies, such as noble ideals, while at the same time holding the actually existing fields or institutions up to those ideals and being like, they aren't meeting these standards. But then at the same time, using that to push ourselves, to raise ourselves up, right? And so I guess I'll just say a couple things about the idea of university and the PMC before closing out. The idea of the university is a community of truth seekers trying to approximate universal truth from different perspectives, fields, and experiences. The field of the university as an idea, which is not the same thing as the institution, that field is constituted by the necessary and contingent contradictions that are generated by the brute fact that the people involved in trying to approximate universal truth necessarily come from different talent bases, different field bases, different experience backgrounds, which means that there will be ways that we disagree. And there will be necessary and contingent contradictions that are generated from those disagreements. But those disagreements aren't just based in people trying to make a name for themselves. That's not just based in sign value. That's not just reputation, recognition kind of games. Those are involved. We have to become aware of how those are involved. But also, there's just the fact that if we all want to try to talk about universal truth, we have our different backgrounds. We have our different experiences. And we don't know where the other is coming from without a whole lot of imagination and projection or sort of subconscious assumptions. And those assumptions probably just make us into assholes, right? As we say. So what we're trying to do is transcend those differences by working through them. That's the idea of the university. But you hold that idea up to the actually existing institution, and the actually existing institution comes up lacking. Not necessarily empty-handed. It's not like it isn't doing anything. It is doing something. It's just that what it's doing is actively going against the ideal that is its only legitimation narrative. At the same time, if you're a working class person who's tried to do activism, and you realized that you were in organizations with people who spend the majority of their time curating their luxury belief systems that they got from the university system, or at least from other people who went through it, and that these are extremely privileged luxury beliefs that come at a great social cost for people who live in shitty situations, then you're probably a little disillusioned with the fact that social change spaces are dominated by college students, and that social change organizations, even when they're not being run by college students, presuppose that their membership, their rank and file, is going to be made up by college students, right? Well, so this is why we have to think about the professional managerial class. It's not enough to say there's the idea of university versus the corporatized neoliberal situation of the institution. No, that institution has captured activism, and activism that is really dumbed down has also captured that institution. And that also means that almost every field, especially in the humanities and social sciences, has then therefore itself also been captured by activist scholarship. Meaning that there are certain things that people are incentivized to say for social capital, for sign value, for success, for grant money, right? Well, yeah, one way with sociology would be obviously to just turn everything into a matter of white supremacy. Oh, I mean, what the example in Anne's piece that hasn't been published yet, maybe eventually it'll be published, but the example from there was in their research, they met a person who was not against reparations, but then was like, but I do want to see more universalist programs like Medicare for All, or instead of reparations to get more black people into college, what if we just had free college? So this person said a couple things like that. And then the researchers behind the scenes were like, ugh, white supremacy. Because there is like this script within these kinds of spaces now where appeals to universality or to universal non-means tested programs, those are, secretly white supremacists because they won't prioritize BLM or whatever, right? Like this is a constant struggle in these spaces. I linked the idea of the university, the book, on the Discord post that I made in the 12 Core Concepts forum. And I talked about how if you want to do some of the readings for this, read The Idea of University by Karl Jaspers. But I also shared Barbara and John Ehrenreich's The Professional Managerial Class, first essay. It's just an essay, but people treat it like it must be Kant's Critique of Pure Reason because they just won't read it, right? It's just an essay, guys. But people are so quick to critique or to pick apart this idea that they coined without actually reading that piece. And a very famous leftist professor was trying to pick it apart at one of our events on tour. Rebecca was there. And I think I was like, he was problematizing this concept, PMC, it's problematic that it would apply to nurses and teachers. Why? Why? Just because there's actual useful occupations in the PMC, that's going to be somehow a problem? Or what? Just because some of them are radically or seriously underpaid? Because certain professions are treated more like workers and put to work a bit more like workers, we're supposed to somehow say that that's a problem for the category? Barbara and John Ehrenreich worked through this problem in that piece. That's not a problem unless you only think about the PMC term from an identitarian workerist position, right? So what is essential about the PMC, and what would you get from that course if you were to do it? So if you read the paper, you'll be ahead of most people in the world who either do or do not like that term. But also you could, and I will link this and it'll become available after today, just binge the course that I did with Elton LK of the Working Class Intelligentsia. In the course, which was the second course we taught at Theory Underground, it came right after the idea of the university. The major takeaway, I think that I can somewhat confidently say this, the major takeaway is that it's a mindset and mode that frames the horizon of possibilities and habitus of not just activists, but also academics or professionals across the board in a way that drives on a certain kind of working class resentment that is harnessed by right-wing populists. It's harnessed by them, but it's not created by them. It's created by the objective situation with the mode of production and its relations of production, and the fact that the entire schooling system was developed to make it so that most people at the level of their identity just see themselves as not made of the right stuff to be deserving of the six-figure salary or to be an opinion haver who's going to deal in influence. And then the people who will feel like they are in fact deserving of that will feel that very deeply and have their own reasons. But those reasons are probably post hoc rationalizations of something that was trained into them by a schooling system that set them up against their peers and then ritually hazed the bad examples of their peers while uplifting the people who were sitting at the front of class, who were performing this sort of like hall monitor, teacher pet function, right? That's a problem. And it's not a problem that was accidental. And I always, it's just weird because anybody who's progressive coded or has coded themselves to speak to a progressive big other at this point does all of this bending over backwards to make sure that anytime we're talking about anything that's a big deal, you all got to know that it's not intentional. It's just the way the system produces things. Because NPR has taken the CIA's pet term, conspiracy theorist, and made it into the new scapegoat. You know, QAnon being the most recent example of that. But the fact of the matter is that the professional managerial class, at its rise, at the beginning of the 20th century, with the principles of scientific management, with the talented 10th, and with propaganda the book, all three of these, we're talking about W.E.B. Du Bois, we're talking about Frederick Winslow Taylor, and we're talking about Edward Bernays. All three of them are just these prime examples of a progressive PMC that is self-aware that it needs to sell the idea of itself to capitalism and to capitalists and to government and say, hey guys, if you don't like these labor organizers, if you don't like these working class strikes, if you don't like these radical unions, if you don't like what's going on over there in Russia right now, then you need us. Because if you keep paying Pinkertons to come in and break up the strike, if you keep paying scabs and Pinkertons to take care of your problems with labor, you only increase the resentment. You only increase the rebellion and intensify it. Rather, we could replace the advanced workers, the people who've been there for 40 years who know how to do everything and don't need you. We could replace the advanced workers, the ones who have everybody's trust. You could replace them with degree havers who come out of our new idea, this public schooling system. And then public schooling was actually put forward in its current form. It's gone through changes, but in its current form, it was put forward as a plan to make it so that the majority of working class children would not ever consider trying to become poets or scientists or inventors, right? We're talking about the academic capture, the bureaucratic capture of all of the fields in a situation that produces a population that reliably has a significant portion of its members hating English versus another reliable portion that hates math. And that's not a natural thing. It's not natural at all for people to hate math or English. But we live in a world where we have like this idea, well, there's cat people and there's dog people. There's people who hate math and there's people who hate English. And then of course there's people who maybe they don't hate either one, but they prefer this one or they prefer that one. And of course we can talk about how these are metonyms. Instead of English, we could say history, right? You could extend this out to anything in the humanities and social sciences versus anything in STEM proper. But this schooling system that reliably produces people who hate certain areas of the life of the mind that they do not understand, it doesn't come from nowhere. It actually comes from a direct reaction against labor organizing. And so it was a weird bait and switch where progressives said, yes, working class children have been excluded from schooling and literacy. Let's give them this public schooling thing, but we won't make philosophers out of them. We won't make artists out of them. We'll teach them how to be good, docile workers. Woodrow Wilson was explicit about this when he was the president of Harvard in his speech that he gives in 1909, I think. I quote that in the Timenergy book. And of course, we talk about it in the PMC course. So the PMC is something produced by an education system with an explicit intent to divide up the working class into the deserving versus the undeserving. Okay? And then, of course, insofar as we feel motivated by these things that are supposed to be good in and of themselves, the idea of truth, of understanding, of beauty, of a community of truth seekers, striving to approximate universal truth from their different experiences and backgrounds. These ideals become the legitimation narratives of that meritocracy. And insofar as we are doing these things on our own outside of the university, it stands to reason that we could in part be doing these things on our own outside of the university because we have internalized the fantasy structure and the incentive structures of that schooling system that was used to ritually haze us and convince us that we're actually not deserving. So there's this interesting struggle of trying to figure out who are we, where are we, how are our fantasies, desires, and goals on the horizon of possibility, something that we can hone in on and actually clarify and maybe come to a truer understanding of, and in doing so, remake our relation to one another and ourselves within the relations of production. And on the other side, like the way that those things have been captured and the fact that we don't have the time energy to actually get the critical distance on that situation to actually know where we are and to know what we're dealing with. And so that is why we led off with the idea of university and the PMC courses. The critical media theory course is something I want to dive into a lot more in the near future. For now, I kind of want to leave it at that. Now, if you're going to get a link to a form here in the next couple of days, and it's going to have questions on it, and some of the questions on it, and by the way, this is optional. There's no like required homework here, of course. This is just so you can test your own knowledge and open up a dialogue with me It's really that simple. Some of these questions will be simple multiple choice questions. Other questions will be like, you can write a paragraph about how the goal of large-scale structural change, because we don't have the good life, leads to the realization of, oh, we're structurally stultified of our time energy. What does that have to do with being virtually purposive creatures? What does that actually have to do with the horizon of possibilities, relations of production, the mode of production? And what do these things have to do with the three crises, the crisis of the academy, the crisis of the attention economy, and the crisis of activism? And you can relate it to your own life. You know, like you can talk about your own experiences in activism or trying to organize with people. You can talk about your own experiences coming from a latchkey family where you didn't really get to have those real relationships with your parents or with other people. Love you. Anne makes a mysterious exit. I don't know why I said mysterious. Bye, Anne. It was more like a wild Anne appears is what I meant to say. Yeah. Okay, cool. She's still listening. Yeah, she's gonna be listening, but she's also on her way to work because she's got a big shift coming up. So give it up for Anne. All right, everybody. I'll close on this. I don't like get emotional or cry for people on the internet. Not on purpose anyway. And I tend to kind of just talk in the way that I do. And the way that I talk about things is often a little vulgar. And I do this weaving thing and I'm bouncing back and forth between these relational concepts, and it can be a lot. And in terms of method, we can get into method and the fire hose approach and retroversion and all of that stuff next time maybe. But what I don't tend to do is, I think this sort of TED Talk approach, which has like you lead off with like a hook that's really personable and makes and endears people to you and kind of shows some kind of emotional social stakes, right? I don't tend to do that. And I'm not really going to, but I'm just going to say that for a not insignificant number of people at Theory Underground, these are not abstract problems. These are the problems that keep us up at night. And that when we're talking about time energy, you got to think about like how I reacted in the second time we talked about Luigi Mangione on Why Left. And I broke down talking about health insurance and why, you know, all of this is so relatable for me and everything, because it's a big deal. And I spent a lot of my time and energy fighting for Medicare for all and coming to certain realizations. And I just am mad and sad about the fact that most of the people I know do not have the basic kinds of healthcare that you would expect everyone to have access to in any developed society. But time energy is even more important. Time energy is the means towards organizing itself. And it's also the means for doing a moratorium on our current situation, which means radically bracketing our natural assumptions about politics, which means, you know, taking up the political epoche. We'll get into that when we get into political phenomenology. It means tarrying with the fact that all the concepts that we're using might not be dialed into our current situation. It means that the leftoidism that we've internalized might be inseparable from actual identitarian commitments to the left. But also, those two things might be very separable. But without taking some time to really work through those things, how will we know? Well, we don't even get to do that because we don't have the time energy, right? It's very frustrating. But it's much more of a sensitive topic when we start thinking about the fact that our parents were usually in robot mode most of our lives. Most of us, our parents were in a sort of robot soldier mode, just trying to survive and just trying to keep their head above water and maintain some basic dignity in a very dehumanizing context. And that there's nothing parents want more than to be able to have a good relationship with their children, and they do not have the means for being able to do that. So these things are really close to my heart. This is what I go to sleep thinking about. It's what I wake up thinking about. And everything else that I am preoccupied by, especially with all of the administrative, technological, and base labor things that I have to do here, those are all means towards some kind of an end. And it's an end that is to, in the short term, get some of us, our time energy, so that working class people and professionals who see no possibilities on the horizon that give them any serious hope are able to work together and slipstream people like me and Mikey and Benjamin, who will hopefully get our time energy. And then by slipstreaming us, you're going to be able to do something that no workers in the history of humanity were able to do, which is accelerate your entry and orientation in these fields while working, while multitasking, while being busy, right? That there might be something we can do with this medium that is able to counter the structural stultification of time energy. And if we do it deliberately, and if we keep the noxious tendencies of the academy, the attention economy, and activism in mind while doing so, we just might be able to lay the conditions of possibility for large-scale structural change. Thank you. Let's go. I'm going to be listening, and I'm going to run and get some coffee while I listen. And I would like to just hear from you all. Questions that you will be beating yourself up for not asking when you're trying to think about how these things are relational and like what they actually mean, or questions that were sparked by anything else that happened here, or if you just have some kind of a contribution. But pretty much just go in whatever order, and I'm all ears.
I want to go first because I'm special. I was curious what folks thought as to whether time energy could be individual or whether there was an essential collective or at least big other element to it.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I'm driving, so I hope that worked. I think with time energy, like kind of within the ever-changing definition, like I think the most kind of recent definition that Dave's provided is that it is this unit that must exist between us, and part of time energy is recognition from others. So while I think an individual or a family could have like relative time and energy, or kind of quote unquote time energy, a community, a whole town, like time energy as this existential or existential, this category, I would say, must exist on this broader level, partly because of the recognition that is required to like sustain and feed into the time energy, is what I have to say to that.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Yeah, and as far back as Waypoint, if you, or even my master's thesis, I was trying to get at relative versus absolute forms of time energy. In the master's thesis, I was trying to get at, because there's this.
You're like really quiet. Unless it's just me, you're like super quiet.
Oh, really? Is that?
I think it might just be you, Anne.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
I think you're
Yeah,
fine. You're
he's
fine
not
over
super
here.
quiet for us.
Yeah, you're fine over here.
Oh, sorry, I'm just having issues, I guess. Thank you.
Phew. So I guess I'm just trying to say that I want to say nobody has time energy. I want to just say flat out, nobody has it. Like absolutely nobody has it. Now, of course, that's what I want to say. Does that actually come from the phenomenon itself? Not necessarily. I have to be suspect of anything that I want to say, right? What are the motivations for wanting to say that? Is it for shock value? Is it just to get people's attention? Because people want to sort of relativize time energy and be like, oh, you know, if I could get off an hour earlier today, I could have a little time energy today. And it's like, so just having a little bit of time and energy at the same time makes them, oh yeah, now I've got some time energy right now. And it's like, oh, okay, cool. So can you learn the violin with that? No, you can't. You actually need large, energy infused, repeatable, and reliably available blocks of time. But the thing is if that's not a socially, if that's not like a default of the commons socially, if that's not just a default setting, then you're not even going to be able to organize with other people to be able to do anything with that. It's not going to work, right? But then we can say, well, yeah, but you can have a class of people who have their time energy. So you can have a class of people who get their time energy, whereas like 90% of people on the planet, they have to spend their lives reducing themselves to necessary labor and preoccupying themselves with that so that they are able to free up that relative time energy for people of a certain class being able to do that. But a big part of the point is to also show people who think that they have it that they don't have it either. So a lot of people think, oh, well, academics have it. No, they don't, right? And so a more recent thing, I guess, from the last year is energy time itself. And talking about how for academics, time energy becomes a sort of fantasy, but their drive is hooked up with energy time, which is doing a lot of different things that are all time sensitive, and we're always working up against deadlines and being highly productive as you juggle that way. And so it's like you're killing yourself by staying up late and getting up early and constantly focusing on productive procrastination and doing things up against deadlines. But it is enjoyable at a certain level of your drive. So you have the fantasy of time energy, but your drive is just, you can't not energy time, right? Well, it's not the same for working class people, right? I don't think a lot of people who do mundane kinds of work, say Amazon, are addicted to the walking 12,000 steps a day and being exhausted, right? Like that's so that they're not energy time junkies. Energy time junkie is a specific kind of person created by our schooling system today. That's a working hypothesis, and it's something to be developed later. But for now, I'll just leave it at that. Benjamin.
Yeah, so as I was listening to your talk, something that stood out to me that I think a lot of people maybe have misrecognized about time energy is that it has a kind of ontic dimension. It's not reducible to individuals. It's not just a question of whether people have it individually, but there seem to be other potential units which possess or don't possess it. And if you would only possess it individually without participating in one of these other abstract ontic collective or larger units, then you wouldn't possess it on the more fundamental level. The structural stultification has an ontic aspect. It's about it not being possessed at some level above the individual level. Would
Right.
that be where you're going with that?
Yeah. And the example I use, because I think we have to have a whole conversation about recognition later. I don't like being thought of as a person who really cares about recognition when that recognition is accolades and honors. But the kind of recognition I do care about is the checks and balances on consciousness, on interpretation, on understanding. Those checks and balances that come from a community of truth seekers working through contradictions, some kind of mutual understanding is necessary so that I know I'm not just, I need to know I'm not just crazy, like off in my own head. I need to know that what I'm working through makes sense to other people. And I need to know that other people from other walks of life and other fields are able to think about it seriously and then respond. Otherwise it could just be in my head. Like I really do think that knowledge is something between us. It's not something that we are safety deposit box havers of, right? It's something that it only exists between humans who are actively feeling over the elephant and then being like, this is what I see. And the other person's like, yep, same here. And they're like, nope, actually it's different. Oh, why do you think that? And then we have to suss it out, right? And the example that I used in my my master's thesis was, I think I used this. I don't know, guys. I don't know where this is. I wrote about this somewhere. It's the way that I get at this way that it has to be between us is to say, you could spend your whole life sacrificing and developing an expertise on the violin. So you become a violin virtuoso, but you're not going to find an audience capable of understanding what it is that you're doing if your society doesn't have time energy. Because you'll be playing for audiences of people who are passive consumers. You will not be playing for audiences of people who can be presumed to be literate in the art field that you're performing in. So, I just use that example. And of course, here's another example I've used elsewhere. The little kid makes a drawing of an elephant, shows it to mama. Mama says, oh, that's a great castle. And, this is sort of a archetypical example because lots of people have heard of it or seen something similar. And the point is like the parent is busy. The kid is always like, oh, look at this. Oh, look at this. Oh, look at this. But if the parent never can be presumed to seriously look at it and really think about it and actually get on your level about it, then you're just off in la la land. And every time you do anything, they go, oh, that's nice, pat you on the head. And of course, this also is the case when it comes to intellectual matters. You spend a lot of time thinking through something, reading and rereading some difficult texts. You come to some profound realization. You write something about it. Does it actually get read? Does anyone actually understand it? Do the people who say that they liked it or thought it was interesting or maybe even cite it somewhere or other, can they actually be presumed to have the time energy to have enough of the priors to have a serious conversation with you? So that's kind of what I'm trying to get at when I'm talking about recognition, which is not the same thing as the symbolic capital of a field. Like the legitimation narrative of that symbolic capital is based in the intellectual's desire for this kind of, like, I want to make a contribution in this, in this domain, but because there's an institution behind that and it gets captured by a bureaucracy of people who are trying to make a name for themselves, these kinds of recognition get crossed. And I think Bourdieu would just say it's probably social capital and cultural capital and symbolic capital, like all the way down. I don't think that it necessarily is, because I had a desire for this kind of understanding at least at the age of 3 years old and ever since then. Like, this is not something that was instilled in me through this schooling system, right? Bourdieu only deals with people who get these objective incentive structures installed inside of them. Like, that's what he's thinking about. He's not thinking about the possibility of like, well, no, but sometimes people just want to understand things and they want to find communities of people who want to strive for understanding. He doesn't think about that. Daniel.
What's up, man? Just taking it all in, dude. You got me a little emotional talking about parents and shit. And then you also like I'm a musician and I've been stultified, like for real. Like I'm burnt out on music. Like I was the kind of guy who would practice, 3 hours a fucking day, read all kinds of fucking esoteric books, study music theory, sharpen my ears up, get into like the phenomenology of fucking music, love to just like meditate on that shit. And you work, and then you're like, oh, I guess I gotta like practice like a couple hours on the weekend, and then maybe 15 minutes on a Friday, and then like I gotta eat right, and I gotta do all this shit, like self-optimize all this fucking shit. And the past couple of months, I was like, man, I'm over it. I'm done. I'm not enjoying it. I don't want to touch a guitar. I don't want to play a piano. I don't want to program a synth. Like that shit's been there for like several months, just sitting there. And I look at it and I'm overwhelmed. I'm just like, and I'm playing with some guys, and then like they have lives, and we're just like, trying to do like these jazz brunch gigs. And it's just like, damn, this isn't it. Like you know what I mean? And then I'll go listen to fucking like, I don't know, like some Stravinsky or some shit, or some like Wayne Shorter, and be like, dude, man, these guys, they had the time. They could get together. They could philosophize about music. They had diverse interests. They could cultivate themselves. They were willing to die for each other, for the music, and they believed in that shit too. Like Plato, there are people like, do you think they believe it, or do they just think it doesn't exist? And they do this performative shit. They just like talk out of both sides of their mouth, kind of nonsense. And that aside, I just wanted to let you know that I was really resonating with that. And it's very real for someone like me. But then I started thinking about like, I don't know, this maybe a contradiction, like talking about, maybe we can reform one church or one town at a time. And I'm like, okay, well, like, I don't know, like I'm thinking about the Unitarian LGBTQ plus church. So I'm like, well, how does that kind of reform happen at a large scale? You know what I mean? Like, fast track kind of way. How is that possible? Like bracketing time energy, like there seems to be some other force, maybe capital is reforming institutions more effectively, more efficiently. It can bypass time energy. It has another kind of law, another kind of circuit that it can do that. You know what I mean? Maybe that's related to, I don't know. I'm just wondering about that. And like PMCs are definitely implicated in that, right? Because they're doing a lot of that heavy lift. And necessarily we do have to organize with PMC, and like, but that makes me wonder about like, how long does it take? How does it happen? If things like that can happen like dispersively and very effectively through existing institutions, and they're like, it's not necessarily obvious if they're helpful or not, but what you're talking about cannot happen for some reason. That's where like this tension is for me right now. Like if and the psychology of the enemy, its tactics, its modal understanding. I'm assuming it's capital that's doing that kind of reform. How is that possible? And how are we implicated in that or utilizing that? And then like what you're talking about is so fucking hard to do because of the very structures, like the medium, the ideological presuppositions that we all carry around with us. This limiting belief or whatever. I know it's a lot.
Yeah.
That's with this.
Yeah, and for right now, my main thing that I would bring in is to say, we didn't even touch on the PCFM or gerrymandering Befindlichkeit, but when we're talking about a Unitarian church being the sort of exemplar Reform Christian approach, and maybe like this bigger question, how does that get mainstreamed? It's like, yeah. That's a real problem. First of all, because we're assuming that is the way that would have to be reformed, right? And which would assume that the progressive sort of values enshrined by that sect are the good, the true, the antidote for the problems of Christianity in America, which I think to some extent can be true, but also people who are dispositionally at a very, very deep level open-minded versus people who are dispositionally at a very deep level prioritizing a different value or value framework, that difference itself could be a product, in the human population, in a society that has a duopolized two-party system, which means that there's two kinds of people. There's the open-minded people versus the parochial people, right? So you have, and this is basic progressive versus conservative, you know. There's a lot more that goes into progressive versus conservative, and there's a lot of different spectrums that get collapsed into mutually exclusive dichotomies. So you take a spectrum between progressive and conservative, and then you take another spectrum between feminine and masculine. These are two different spectrums of the human soul. Each one could be its own axis, but because we're one-dimensionalized in the duopoly, everything gets flattened, and now all of a sudden progressive is also coded feminine. Conservative
so like
gets coded
exponential
masculine. Yeah.
moves.
Sorry, what?
Like the flattening is what's able to expedite these kinds of moves and changes. They're like small, low stakes. They can move fast, but they have, you know, it's like the volume. They can have such a large impact. If that's making any sense.
I think so. A way of sort of saying that would be that when nobody has time energy and everybody's structurally stultified, yet we need to have a sense of self, and we need to be able to relate to one another, and we need to be somewhat intelligible to other people. The identities that we can purchase and the scripts we can learn by rote to regurgitate in our own words a little bit, you know, put our own personality on it a little bit, the scripts get dumber, right? Like the identities get dumber. The scripts and the identities get dumbed down because we're exhausted people who don't have the time energy to have a more robust sort of basis as singularities.
Can you talk about singularity versus particularity? I saw Nance mention something about Levinas and like it's singular, not particular, and I'm kind of very curious about that.
Oh, so this is actually one of those conversations that I'd like to think about a little bit more before doing, but I'll just say for now, universal is like some kind of a deep truth that applies to everyone or everything. Whereas singular is going to be like that, but for an individual, right? It's like this robust, rich sense of individuality. Whereas like particular, it could just be any particular thing about you. Like that's not your deep truth necessarily. That's not, so like my story, I could just sit here and spit facts about my story, and it would involve, I mean, we could do 100 million facts about Dave, and those facts are missing anything really relevant. Whereas if we were to get to something essential about me, well, then that would be something about me as a singularity. I'm characterizing instead of defining because that's just how I think, but there's more that goes into it, and Mikey does something using Žižek and Hegel. And what I'm doing is, or the way that I just characterize that, I think is not something he would disagree with. But I haven't done anything more rigorous with it than that.
Cool.
So like, a way of thinking about it also would just be to say that there's individuals and there's groups. Most people's idea of society is that it's a bunch of groups, and those groups are made up of individuals. You could just say, no, it's not made up of a bunch of groups. There's really just one group. It's the human species. That's the group. And it's all just individuals in that group, right?
Yeah.
And breaking out of thinking about individuals and groups is one of the big things that Marx, Heidegger, Lacan, Levinas, Bourdieu, etc., all have like they all have big contributions to breaking out of thinking about individuals and groups. But the singularity, what we're getting at with the singularity is like, you're not replaceable. Like a particular person is kind of exchangeable in a sort of sense. Like it's just an individual, another individual, it's just a bunch of atoms. But when we're talking about like you and your singularity, we're talking about the part of you that is not exchangeable with anything else. It's you have unique potentials, you have unique talents, and there's there's a way that there's a singularity there, but you can only really discover it in this dialectical relation with the universal. You're not going to you're not going to be able to do that if your relation is between particular and general, right? Like I think the general way of just being an average everydayness is I'm just a particular person, but there's also the general person, you know. I would like to hear from other people because this is not actually, these are not my sharpest tools in my toolkit, and I'm curious if anybody else has anything that they would add to this distinction. Am I a closet Platonist, says Jacob? Benjamin, as the actual Platonist, how do you think about these terms? Are they all just the same thing for you? Would you be able, yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, so for me, a universal is something very big that you can kind of hold open and come back to. So it's an abstraction. And then when you concretize an abstraction, when you take it down a level and bring it closer and make it more approachable, this enables you to use it in a particular situation or for a particular purpose, but at the cost of highlighting the specific features that are relevant for that purpose or use. And when you highlight some things, you necessarily occlude or exclude other things that drop out or fall into the background. So there's a need then to return to the abstraction, to come back to it for the purposes of reconceptualizing it or reconcretizing it in a new form. So you might say that, all right, I'll just go very Platonist for a second, and I'm not necessarily committed to this, but this would be a very Platonist way of putting it. So there's the good, and then there's a good man, right? Now, a good man, we could start with the idea of the good man, which is not the same as the good, right? It's more concrete. It's reduced a lower level from the good in itself so that you can use it to describe a man, right? Nevertheless, the good man sits above actual good men who are not quite as good as the ideal of the good man, right? But nonetheless have some likeness or similarity to the good man. And then beneath that level, you would have artistic depictions of good men, which are less real than actual good people, right? But also still in a chain of being that is in relation to the good. And of course, if you want to talk about other good things, then you would have to move around. Now, which specific units is it appropriate to apply a concept like the good to? And at what point should you maybe use other abstractions? So one way of talking about a good man that would be different from using good would be a term like free, a free man, right? Or a just man or a wise man. These are also abstractions that can be potentially open in the way that the notion of the good is open, but they tend to gesture at certain things while leaving out other things. So they're universals, but they're somewhat more specific, perhaps, than the good. They have some kind of lean. They invite you to notice certain things. For instance, courageous would be very different in terms of what you might immediately think of versus just. And yet there is a similarity between the two, and the good man would be both courageous and just, would have both of these virtues. So what are the virtues? The virtues are less unitary than the good, but they are abstractions that you can use to try to evaluate particular people in view of that. Now, the notion of singularity is, I think, a very Mikey notion, and it comes out of what Mikey has read and is interested in, and it's something which doesn't so immediately come into my scheme, obviously. I'm sure you could bring it in through the concept of soul, though in Platonism, souls emanate from the world soul. So the soul is never completely individuated or cut off, right? Particular souls are emanations of the world soul, which, yeah, and depending on exactly how seriously you take the Timaeus, this can all be cosmologized and schematized in relation to the demiurge, and I could go into a bunch of yada yada about that. But that would be kind of, my thought with singularity, and this is something that I have occasionally had thoughts of. I'd like to know exactly what's meant when this term gets used in the TU space. because it is clear to me that you're not using it in the way that, say, somebody would use the word individual. But it's also easy to understand it that way. And it's easy for it to be misrecognized as that. Yeah. So that would be my question.
Can we also say an individual could be further particularized, further divided up and schematized and investigated, whereas the singularity, it just kind of terminates at the singularity.
So I'll just say this for now. One of the complications here is that German didn't maintain this distinction between general and universal. The way we have this word general, exceptions prove the rule. General never applies to everything. It's more of like how Heidegger says proximally for the most part. In that sort of sense, Heidegger is a theorist of the general human condition. He's not doing a sort of, this is a hardline universal truth kind of thing. He's just going, we can be pretty sure X, we can be pretty sure Y, based on things that are just givens, right? Because he's interested in bringing back in the some of the essential presuppositions that Descartes and people who followed after him had just, cut off by just assuming subjectivity as like the most essential point for coming to truth, right? But I kind of want to set this aside because there's a really interesting conversation being had there between Mikey and McGowan on this confusion, because if they're not clarifying the difference between general and universal, a lot of times when people who are kind of influenced by the Slavonian school are talking about universals, they're talking about the general, and vice versa. Like, it gets confused. And so Todd was like, Mikey, you need to write a paper about this, right? Because there's all this confusion following from Hegel. And maybe we could just say, Mikey, watch the part of my lecture from today and maybe address it in your next seminar. We all want to hear you talk about it. But for now, I want to say a few things before I set you all free for the day. And before I can do that, I did want to check really quick, is there anything else directly related to the lecture on these core concepts or how they relate before I get into this quick little update that will tell you about some stuff that's coming in the next week, next month, next few months, stuff that we're doing. It'll be that kind of thing.
I might say one thing real quick. The bit where Mikey and I talked about Bob Dylan, this concept of singularity came up and was quite important in that discussion as well, if somebody wants to see it kind of applied and talked about in another setting.
All right, so I'll just go through this. So I have 6 points here. First of all, I'm inviting you all to some discussions. All right, I'll explain what those are in a second. But there's going to be one on Tuesday. There's going to be one. Well, we're still trying to figure out if it's happening on Thursday, but you're definitely invited to a Zoom call for a live broadcast of something on Thursday. And so we'll come back to that in a moment. There's a bunch of hybrid events that are currently in the works. And there's a US tour. Okay, so I did put out something on the Discord. Hold on. Let's go ahead and just pull up the Discord here. So I can actually say I want to say where these things are so that people can go and comment where they need to if they are interested. But if you look at the US Tour 2025, which should be available to anybody who is anyone who has the Basecamp access should be able to see it. There's one that says wanna hit TUCon plus LAC plus Platypus Affiliated Society with us. You could fly into the United States and then go to LAC and then go to the TUCon thing and then go to the Platypus Affiliated Society things all within the span of like 3 weeks. It's possible. Most of you have to work. Most of you have big decisions to make. You only can come for a few days. You might not be able to come during the month of March at all, in which case maybe you should be thinking about between July and September. We've got plans in the works for another tour. But yeah, LAC, Platypus, TUCon, all of that stuff happening in March. It's very exciting. And so be thinking about it. We currently have plans to go to at least 7 cities, and there are many spots along the way that we could presumably stop, right? If there was really great opportunities for us. And what is a great opportunity in my opinion, right? In my opinion, a great opportunity is where there's people who have like an earnest desire to think about the kinds of things that we're on about. Okay. Well, it's this, most of you would say, well, I know one person in my city who's like that. And then you'd point at yourself. And you might go, well, I could think of maybe a couple other people who would want to do that. Well, if it's on the way and you are looking to host us, or if you want to be a guide around your city, you'd like to show us something or whatever, well, you can at least make the offer. We'll take it into consideration as we're plotting things out. But also, if you want us to come to your town or city on this tour or in the future, you can get involved with some of the ground game experiments that we're currently doing. And so Nance and I are both doing some of this stuff right now. I've been doing these early morning breakfasts. I originally put them on meetup.com as it's a monthly breakfast called Early Risers. Meets at 6:30 a.m. And because it's been pretty successful, I've actually added a few other ones that I do in the week or like on a weekly basis, right? And I'm experimenting with different things, but the reason I like the Early Risers concept is because it cuts out a certain kind of person who is a tourist in intellectual spaces. I have wasted too much of my life catering to rooms full of tourists who just want to sit there and drink beer and sort of free associate between popular bestsellers or whatever the philosophical. There's no directionality. There's no serious reading of one another's work. There's no. If drinking has to be present for somebody to get a lot out of philosophy or theory, personally, I'm just not interested. And I definitely wouldn't go out of my way when traveling the country to try to go and cater to an audience full of people like that. I've the early morning filter is in part the sober filter, but it's also just like this person will like leave their house at 5:30 a.m., at 5:45, at 5:50, and then show up for something like this. A person who wakes up early and shows up like that person is hungry. And the thing is like, it's one thing for people to find each other on the internet when they're already passionate about something. But if we're talking about doing IRL organizing, the different ways that we connect with people locally are going to necessarily reveal and conceal. Certain people will be attracted and certain people will be cut out of the picture, right? And so when Kira was saying, oh, maybe I'll do that, except I might do the night owl version, I said that would defeat the purpose. And the reason I said that would defeat the purpose is because night owls are generally a younger demographic, right? They're generally younger and they're generally less hungry for what it is that we're doing. So they're not going to be able to meet us at the level of passion. If you're an exception to that general rule, well, then that's amazing and that's great. But this general rule is something we're trying to navigate and counter with this organizing. And so if you want to contact me and you want to talk about like, oh, how would I do that in my own city? I would love to start that conversation. And what I'd probably do is get you to lead one or two of these before we come to your city. And then we'd do one with you when we come to your city. And then we might use that to also lead up to some kind of like a bigger, fancier event. All kinds of things happening behind the scenes, conversations revolving around those kinds of events. And the other sort of entrance points that funnel people into some of the special stuff that we're thinking about doing, I'm not going to talk about it here. It's not the time. But you can DM me, but you can also get into the comment section there, like here Jacob and Nance did. Okay. And so I'll actually share the link to that one right now. You should have access. But now I want to close out on these other points here. Let me just see if I can't find the link. I'm not going to bother right now. Okay. The anthologies. A couple of people were under the impression the anthologies aren't happening at all, because if you watch the Turn seminar session, I ended up being like, I don't want to publish anthologies. I don't care about anthologies. Like, I was really trying to communicate a book that is just a collection of pieces where there was no serious engagement with the authors who put these things together. That is not what I'm interested in. Anthology has that connotation at this point. That's kind of irritating to me. A lot of people are like, oh yeah, I'll write something for an anthology, but they're not planning on reading other people in that anthology. Well, in my world, you don't exist if you're not in Theory Underground. You're doing something on the internet. Maybe we are being confused for being in your field, but what we're doing, this kind of building up the milieu kind of thing, the people who are contributing to that are the people who I'm trying to prioritize. And the Turn, as it was developed, as it currently stands, it's supposed to be an opportunity for people to sort of really get their turn, right? And people at TUCon who only had a few people present, and then we never really got to go over and engage with their stuff. Part of the point of the Turn is to be able to do that with some people. Now, not everything that came out of that's going to get published, but a lot of the stuff will be, and we'll have some good updates on that soon. But I'm mainly just saying this so that people know there's still stuff in the works. A couple people referenced thinking from that lecture, oh, you're not doing that anymore. No, we're still doing it. We're just trying to be more deliberate. We're trying to be more thoughtful. That's what we're trying to do. So that doesn't mean these papers are not on the table anymore. The Agora stuff. In the Agora lecture, I definitely set it up like it's something you can undergo, like the Turn. And that's true, but we're in the process of developing it. And currently where it's at is we've got plans to be developing it all of this tour in March. And there's some conversations ahead of time that have to be had. And those are the conversations I want to invite you all to. So the Agora and alien anthropology and the dredge, these are concepts that we're developing for the US tour. They're going to be parts of ongoing experiments. And I have to read you all my little working definition for the Agora so I can show you how or why to get involved with the two discussions that are happening this week. So I said the Agora is a relational concept that cannot be thought through or fleshed out well without a basis in the fundamental problems, core concepts, and methodological operating assumptions of the research we're doing with alien anthropology into the conditions of possibility for large-scale structural change, which would be for the sake of T3 institutions, right? Time, energy, tutelage, and talent, in the era of the PCFM, post-class fractured mass. Part of the situation with the PCFM requires understanding something about the black and red boxes. I set up the Agora in relation to the black box in my first seminar of 2025, 2 weeks ago, which has those terms in its title. The red box tie-in will come later. All this jargon is just shorthand for the inward-facing conversations, not something we would ever talk. So I say this little aside about the jargon because I felt it was necessary. But anyway, defining a term that is relational and only meaningful in the sense of a process or method leads too easily to reification. Nevertheless, let's get a short working definition on the table. Agora, a kind of space opened up by a style of oration that explicitly and implicitly experiments with different ways of interpolating or pointing out, picking out different aspects of the post-class fractured mass by employing strategies and Bildung that come out of TU's attempt to understand the situation. The Agora is a hybrid space between the internet and IRL, mixing audiences that are deep in the know with randos who are walking by, dropping in on a live stream, or who happen to be in a class at the university that is collaborating with the Agora concept. And then I do a little gatekeeping of the concept to help really pin it down, show this, make it a little bit more rigorous. So I say for something to count as the Agora, what would it have to do? Well, it has to be put on by people who don't assume that we know what it is to be human. That's a big part of like what it means to be doing alien anthropology as well. Not assuming we know what it is to be human, not assuming that we're all part of the same society, not assuming that we have some kind of baseline mutual understanding that's provided with our culture or language. No, we assume the opposite, in fact. Next would be we don't know how to communicate outside of or across niches in rigorous ways. Right now there's academic jargon and insider speak versus popular speaking, and popular speaking is just considered not rigorous, and it's this more superficial thing. Trying to bridge that, or trying to find some other style of communication that transcends that dichotomy, is part of the goal here. And then 3, the message of our central nervous system extended through the environmental medium is TMI, FOMO, ADHD, me, faster, right? That's just like taking McLuhan and Virilio and Baudrillard and Postman from critical media theory, and then just being a realist about that situation. Finally, the discursive means employed harness and counter those tendencies as scientifically as possible. And then I say, we'll get into that on my seminar when I get into method, which my next seminar will get more into method, and I'll be responding to Daniel's questions there. And then this means that the experiments follow from and then inform research that is not just done in the underground, nor just in the academy, but across and between and outside of such spaces. I mean, really, I'm trying to drive home the point that you have to have certain theoretical operating assumptions for it to be the agora, but more importantly, or at least crucially, is the hybridity of the space, right? Whether you're a really good public speaker or you're absolute shit, the question is have you ever really had an opportunity to speak to a mixed audience? Like an audience that is not just academic, is not just internet, is not just people walking by on the street, is not just people who are like way more invested and actually they're in the Zoom call and they've been following the work, right? Thinking about that in this way that has like a lot of our theoretical assumptions in place. Well, the point is that we're experimenting with this on tour, but before the tour even begins, we're experimenting with this in my classroom. My classroom for sociological communication, Sociology 122, is a lab. It's a scientific research lab. We can use it for whatever we want, right? They've given me like this absolute and total dictatorial authority to just do whatever I want with this class. Now, I'm not going to abuse that. I'm going to do my best to make sure that what they're learning is sociological communication. But part of how we learn that is by doing it, right? Actually doing it. And so I get to make this classroom session that happens once per week into something that is itself a hybrid, in the sense of you guys can be present. It can be live streamed so that anyone speaking is speaking to a room full of students, as well as TU people, as well as the internet. And then the next step would be to take that onto the road on tour, right? So the first instance of this kind of speech is going to be me and Benjamin talking about what is society next Thursday. It's just going to be a live recording of why left. And my students are not going to see it they'll see it coming because I'll tell them about it before it happens. But really, like, they're not prepared in a sort of sense. Like, this is not something that I think most students really have an opportunity to see happen. And so like I get to have them all reflect on the experience about what it is to communicate in the situation of the post-class fractured mass, right? Well, I'm also getting to do research on them in this sort of sense of like surveying them, asking them questions, and then getting their responses. And then on the basis of those responses, developing even better questions for them. And then also from those experiences developing questionnaires that we get to take on tour. And I'll also be working with those students to develop a questionnaire for you all so that they will be researching you, and then you can potentially be researching them. So the first conversation I'm inviting you to is on Tuesday. I'm going to pull up the sheet right here so I can double check the time, unless Benjamin, you have it right in front of you already. Let's see. What is Tuesday? Is Tuesday the 21st? Yeah. So on the 21st, the discussion is at 3 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. or 1300 Mountain Time, my time. That's the time that's shown on the sheet. And yeah, just use this Zoom link, hop on in. And what we're going to do is just go over the questions that I put together for my classes that they've already responded to. So you'll get to see their responses. Their names will be anonymous. You won't know who's who. And that's obviously very important for their protections, ethical code of conduct, whatever. But the basic point is you will get to see the results of the questions, and you'll all get to be big-brained critical thinkers judging the questions themselves. Are the questions put together in such a way that generate useful information that we can do something with to better inform ourselves about the situation with academia, with the PMC, with the horizon of possibilities for your average college student today, or your average college student's today's relation to the big other, or what they think most other people think about certain things. I got lots of really interesting results. I'm excited to go over it with Nance and anyone else who comes. And on the basis of going over those results, we'll get to put together some follow-up questions. Okay, any questions about any of that stuff before we close it out? Basically, I'm saying that every one of you gets to be a part of a sort of research initiative that couldn't have been done in a different decade or century. This kind of research from the underground, done on students, and done from students back onto the underground, but then also from both cohorts, done on people on the streets of cities all across the United States on 2 tours within the same year. Like, that's just not something that I'm aware of ever happening before. The question is, well, how do we make what we gather from that inquiry useful? These are genuine problems, and I don't think that typical surveys really get us there, right? So, all right, everybody, thank you. That was a lot, and I hope you soak it in. I hope to see you on Tuesday, if not then Thursday. And of course, you have a lot of reading to do if you're excited for Benjamin or Nina's courses. I am going to be definitely reading Nina's Heidegger selection and Benjamin's, well, it's not a selection, it's The Republic, this one right here. So we've got a really exciting week ahead of us. Thank you.